So we'll talk about the nervous system regulation of ventilation. Before we do that, let's just recall that to take a breath, to inhale, that's the active process, and we need to use muscles to do that. What we're doing is we're actually taking our chest cavity and expanding it. So we're using energy to expand it, and we do that with muscles, where our diaphragm contracts and flattens. So that goes down, and our intercostal muscles contract and lift and expand our rib cage. So we're taking the volume of our thoracic cavity and we're making it bigger. And if we remember Boyle's law, we're making a volume bigger, so the pressure in that system decreases, and air, we create a vacuum, so air is going to rush in to equalize that vacuum. Remember that if we have some sort of resistance to flow, for example, a foreign body in the trachea, mucus down in the airways of our lungs, or an asthma attack where we have bronchial constriction, whatever the resistance to flow, if we have to overcome that, we're going to have to use more muscles. And the purpose of these muscles are to actually increase the volume. So if we remember, the purpose of the accessory muscles of inhalation is to increase the volume of our chest cavity. If we can increase the volume of our chest cavity, we can actually make a larger or a more negative pressure, which hopefully can cause a higher airflow to overcome whatever that resistance is. And the accessory muscles of inhalation, again, we're trying to increase the size of the thoracic cavity to generate a bigger negative pressure, thereby increasing the airflow into the lungs. So the sternocleidomastoid muscle, that's that big muscle that you see in the neck when people are angry. Scalenes and pectoral muscles, these just help expand the rib cage to make a larger thoracic cavity. Accessory muscles of exhalation, remember, this is the reverse. We're trying to squeeze out the air, so we're trying to increase the pressure to squeeze the air out of the lungs. So we're trying to decrease the thoracic cavity to create more positive pressure, forcing air out. And this is, if we're exhaling, if we're using accessory muscles to exhale, normally that's a passive process, but this is, if we're using muscles to do that, that's an active process that requires energy, and they can get tired quickly. So we have these abdominal muscles contract, pushing the diaphragm up, and intercostal muscles push down on the sternum and the ribs. Again, we're just trying to squeeze that air out, so we're increasing the pressure. That should be an arrow, not a T. And just because we talked about these, just a quick review of these concepts. Compliance is the ability of the lungs to stretch, and airway resistance is a measure of how easily that air moves down the lungs. If we have a bunch of mucus in here, it obviously is going to prevent the air from flowing as easy, so we're going to have to work harder to overcome that resistance. So resistance, increasing the resistance, means we'll have to work harder to overcome that resistance. And that's kind of the key point here, is that we have to work harder. So the question then becomes, how does our brains know when to breathe harder? This is an unconscious thing, and if you've ever seen someone having a hard time breathing and they're unconscious, or they're not obviously not under conscious control. Hey, I need to work harder even people who are conscious of the fact that they're having a hard time breathing, they're not really controlling that. They have panic and they are aware that they have a sensation of difficulty breathing, but they're not under control of this process. So to do that, we have to start thinking about the regulation of ventilation. And the body does this with a detection mechanism, chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors just come from the word here, chemo, not for cancer medicines, but that's just for chemical. So we have chemical, and then we have receptor, and that's just a detection, a way that the tissues and cells detect their environment. So you could really even just take that a step back and just think about the eye, and how do we see. We actually have light receptors in our retina that the light actually stimulates these receptors, and basically it tells our brains that there's light here, and our brains can interpret that as a picture. In this case, we have a receptor, something that's receiving a signal, and it's just detecting a chemical, so we just call that a chemo. We have central chemoreceptors and peripheral chemoreceptors when we're talking about breathing. Central chemoreceptors are located in the brainstem, and this is involved with detection of acids in our blood. And if we remember from the last part of this lecture, CO2 plus water makes an acid. So if we don't ventilate very well, the CO2 in our blood goes up, which makes the acid in our blood go up. And this is really the mechanism for how we breathe. This is going to sense an increase in acid, or for simplicity fact, I'll just say carbon dioxide. So it senses a increase in carbon dioxide. Peripheral are located in our aorta, for example, and that is going to detect a drop, not in carbon dioxide or anything like that, but that's where we detect a drop in oxygen. So you might think that it might seem intuitive to think that that we breathe because we need oxygen, and that's true, but in reality we have so much lung tissue that we have lots and lots of reserve of carbon or of oxygen. So how we take a breath is actually not to get oxygen, but actually to get rid of carbon dioxide. And this is central chemoreceptors. This is the primary way we take a breath. And this, let's say for example, this no longer works anymore. The carbon dioxide keeps going up and we have no stimulation to breathe. And then this would be like a backup mechanism. Alright, so carbon dioxide keeps going up, but our brains aren't responsive to it. Eventually the oxygen is going to start to drop, and that's when we have this backup mechanism takes into effect and tells our brains to take a breath. So again, central chemoreceptors, they sense acid, or easier known as carbon dioxide, and our peripheral chemoreceptors are going to detect a decrease in oxygen, and that's just a backup mechanism. So a backup mechanism. When we talk about that, we talk about the brain being sensitive to an increase in carbon dioxide. That is what most people are responsive to the increase in carbon dioxide, and that's what tells us to take a breath. And we call that hypercarbic drive. So hyper for above, carbic for carbon, in this case carbon dioxide. So hypercarbic drive, that is our brains being stimulated to breathe by the increase in carbon dioxide. The increase in carbon dioxide is what tells us to take a breath. So it's hypercarbic drive. We breathe by a hypercarbic drive situation. Some patients, for example, that COPD patient, we'll talk about what that means, but that is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. These patients, sometimes they have such a high level of carbon dioxide because their lungs are so diseased that they no longer are responsive to that increase in carbon dioxide. So that backup mechanism is what allows them to breathe. So we mentioned that the peripheral chemoreceptors detect a decrease in oxygen. When the patient is stimulates to breathe by that decrease in oxygen, we call that a hypoxic drive. Hypo for low, oxy for oxygen. So hypoxic drive. So just know those two terms. Hypercarbic drive is how most people breathe, and that's again in response to the increase in carbon dioxide. Hypoxic drive is a backup mechanism which some folks, like COPD patients, have, where they're no longer responsive to the increase in carbon dioxide. So as a result, the oxygen is what stimulates their breathing. So we want to look into those chemoreceptors a little bit more, and when we're talking about this, kind of think about the fact that if we need a larger volume of air to overcome some resistance, or maybe we're just exercising, we recruit more muscle. So this is the idea behind this. And how does the brain know to use more muscles to breathe? So that's the question. How does the brain know that? And we have a rise in carbon dioxide. We have the rise in carbon dioxide, which tells our brain stem to take a breath. So we're going to look at a few different respiratory centers in the brainstem, and what we'll find is that there's 3 different ones that we need to be familiar with, and each one has a different level of what they're sensitive to, and that might make a little bit more sense here in a second. So these are the 3 that you need to know. Don't worry about this for right now, but we need to know the dorsal respiratory group, the DRG, the ventral respiratory group, and the apneustic center. So these are just really the 3 centers that we need to know, and they're located in the brainstem. So here's the part of the brainstem that controls those vital functions. So again, when they are stimulated, here's the DRG. When they're stimulated, they're going to send a signal down our spinal cord and off of the phrenic nerve, off the spinal cord down the phrenic nerve to our diaphragm, and some are going to down the spinal cord to different muscles, the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which is right here, and the intercostal muscles, for example. So that's how this function works. So these sense the rise in carbon dioxide, and they send a signal to the muscles. So they send the signal to the muscles via the spinal cord. So that raises a kind of a side point here. If we have an injury of the spinal cord above the phrenic nerve, then that signal cannot get to the diaphragm, and then that patient would not be breathing when you get there. So think about Christopher Reeve. He broke he broke at C1 and C2. He injured his spinal cord at C2. That message could not get down his spinal cord to his phrenic nerve, to his diaphragm to take a breath. But we'll go back and we'll talk about each of these centers in more detail. So we talk about the DRG, the dorsal respiratory group. We're really talking about quiet breathing. And this is where we're not stressed, we're not running a marathon, we're sitting still, we're watching TV, we're not using any excessive energy to breathe. Just when the diaphragm contracts, it drops, and we're going to create the extra volume there, and that is going to be good enough for breathing for this point. So if you look at the CO2 level in the blood versus time, we're going to have an increase in you're going to see an increase in CO2. At such point, we're going to be stimulating our DRG. Our DRG is going to say, "Hey, that's a lot of carbon dioxide. Time to take a breath." And we take a breath. We get rid of all that carbon dioxide in our lungs. The carbon dioxide in our blood goes down, and it's going to start to climb because it's been a few seconds later, to which point we're going to be stimulated to breathe again, and our DRG says that's a lot of carbon dioxide, take a breath, and we get rid of it, and it goes down and everybody's happy. So I'm going to do actually have a little animation here to illustrate everything I just said. So we have the carbon dioxide goes up, we're stimulated to take a breath, that's the DRG being stimulated, a little flash, the carbon dioxide level goes down, and we repeat this whole process. The important point here is that the nice quiet breathing, the diaphragm is doing enough to get rid of enough carbon dioxide that everybody's happy. Alright, so let's say that we are exercising, or going back to the patient that's sick, they have some mucus, or they're having an asthma attack, or back to that patient that has the rib fractures and they can't breathe very well. For whatever reason, we either are making lots of carbon dioxide because we're exercising, or we're sick, our lungs are diseased, so we can't get rid of that carbon dioxide as well. Either way, we have a situation here where we didn't get rid of all that carbon dioxide. If you notice right here, the carbon dioxide level just didn't go down. We're either making too much, or that breath with the diaphragm did not get rid of that carbon dioxide. So as you see, we're actually increasing the level of carbon dioxide. So back here we had take a breath, and we told the diaphragm to take a breath. Here we told the diaphragm to take a breath, but as you notice, we're going to have even more and more carbon dioxide being built up. So that's eventually going to get to a point where we stimulate the VRG. And the VRG is going to say, all right, use those sternocleidomastoid muscles. Make a larger volume in the chest cavity to either get rid of some of that excess carbon dioxide that we're making, or to overcome that resistance to flow so we can get rid of some more of that carbon dioxide. Alright, so hopefully the VRG will kick in, will ventilate more air in and out of our lungs, and we can get rid of some of that carbon dioxide. But let's say we have a where we don't get rid of the carbon dioxide, so our VRG stimulates, the DRG and the VRG stimulates a breath, but we still have carbon dioxide going up, up, and up. We actually have another center that in our brainstem, and that's called the the apneustic center. So here you go. The DRG stimulates a breath. We still have carbon dioxide that didn't get cleared from our blood, and the carbon dioxide keeps going up. The VRG stimulates the sternocleidomastoid muscles, for example. We still don't get rid of all that carbon dioxide here. So we're going to have the diaphragm here, the sternocleidomastoids, for example, here, and then we're going to activate. It's going to get to a new level. Our brainstem is going to be responsive now to an even higher level, and the the apneustic center is going to stimulate a very large volume of breath, as well as abdominal muscle, to squeeze out as much air as we can. So the idea here is, the higher the level of carbon dioxide, whether it is from exercise or exertion, or we have some sort of ventilation issue, either way, we're having an increase in carbon dioxide. So we have an increase in carbon dioxide either because we're making a lot of carbon dioxide, or we have a ventilation issue, a resistance to flow, a structural issue like those rib fractures. Either way, we're increasing how much carbon dioxide is in our blood, so we have more of the respiratory centers being activated because that carbon dioxide keeps going up. It's not being cleared by just the DRG with the diaphragm. I hope that makes sense. Please let me know if it doesn't, because that's not necessarily each respiratory center is important to know, but just this concept that as more carbon dioxide is in our blood, parts of our brainstem respond with more muscle. That's the take-home, is that the more active or the poorer the ventilation, the more carbon dioxide is in our blood. The more carbon dioxide in our blood, the more our brainstem is going to be responsive to that increase in carbon dioxide. Different areas of the brainstem activates different muscles. So the DRG is the diaphragm, maybe a little bit of the intercostal muscles, just nice quiet breathing. We don't have to create a lot of volume for that nice quiet breathing. But as our carbon dioxide keeps going up, we have to use more muscle. So we get the VRG is stimulated, so we get the sternocleidomastoid muscles. We're really working to breathe, and finally the apneustic center, where we're really using every bit of muscle we have to create a huge volume of air, or volume in our chest cavity. And we're using muscles to squeeze out air from our lungs to clear that as best we can. And the whole idea, again, is to ventilate, get fresh air in, and get rid of the carbon dioxide.